just because you've started down your career as an employee in a larger company does not mean that you cannot be an entrepreneur. In fact, actually, most solid entrepreneurs start that way.
Exactly.
Right. So that's an important factor. And then if you know that you're planning on heading in that direction, there are certain ways to start your journey to set yourself up to gain the skills and gain the expertise that you need to be successful after.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the AUD podcast channel. We have a very, very special guest with us today, Mr. Muhammed Mekki. Muhammed, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. So, Muhammed, as we were just talking off camera, I've known about you through my close friend Omar for a long time. And I know your journey. I've followed your journey with Namshi and now with AstroLabs. And when I was doing my research, you've had a very interesting career. And listening to your personality, you said you are someone who likes to hop around and you're very curious and interested in many things. I think your career speaks to that quite well. So for today, I wanted to really dive into entrepreneurship. Because listening to your story, there are so many challenges that, for example, I'm going through right now as an early stage entrepreneur, and I think so many other people are going through, that your experience could provide so much value to them. So we're going to dive into a lot of different areas, but before we get into everything, Muhammad, why don't you give all of us a little bit of background about yourself, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, thanks again, Khalid, for having me on this show. Muhammed Mekki, I'm Iraqi, American. I was born in London. Very typical kind of Dubai profile.
Yeah.
Been living here since 2010. My wife and I have 3 children, 10, 8, and 5 years old. I came out here after finishing my studies and a bit of work in the United States. So I grew up mostly in the US.
Yeah.
So in 2010, moved out to Dubai after finishing my MBA and started for a year working at McKinsey as a consultant. Then the shift really happened, which is I had an opportunity to co-found an e-commerce company, Namshi. This is back in 2011, before a lot of the tech boom had happened in the region. So one of the early experiences in building and scaling up a tech company in the region. So it was a crazy ride. We hired almost 100 people in a year.
Wow.
We raised, at the time, was the largest round of VC funding. It was about $20 million in order to scale up this concept in the region. So it was a good way for me to take that Silicon Valley experience I had back at Stanford and apply it here in the region kind of early on. And it really sparked my interest and bug around entrepreneurship. From there, a couple years in, one of my partners, Louis Lebos, and myself decided that, you know what, there's an even bigger thing happening, which is this entire wave of entrepreneurship coming to the region. And so we left Namshi and started AstroLabs in 2013. And we've been supporting the development of this ecosystem since then. In different capacities. So today, if we fast forward, AstroLabs has now, across the Gulf, mostly operating in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, run by our CEO, Roland Daher, and helping companies from around the world enter into the Gulf and do business in the Gulf.
Yeah.
So that's been kind of on the professional side.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for sharing that, giving us context with that. So when I was doing my research, what I want to talk about today is kind of the differences between your Namshi experience and your AstroLab experience, because I think those are 2 very different experiences and probably at 2 very different phases of your life and your experience as an entrepreneur. So like you said, you left the consulting group after 2 years, and then after a year, and then you went to Namshi for 2 years, and then you and Louis went and opened AstroLabs. Now, so I watched a podcast that you were on, so I have a lot of the context. And I also watched the podcast that you hosted, so we're going to be hitting those too. So what was interesting with Namshi is I related to that story a lot because you had to, it was venture backed, so you guys raised a lot of money, like you said, hired 100 people in a year. And then the story of you guys were banking on, once we launch this website, everything's going to go off, and nothing kind of happened. And then looking at AstroLabs, you said the first 3 to 4 years are very difficult. And then once Google came in, that really helped things move. And then the DMCC and the co-working space. So in both those stories, there was a period of uncertainty, and it took something specific to take you to that next level. when it comes to entrepreneurship, as entrepreneurs, we believe in our vision. We're like, this is the way to go, and we think it'll work. But also, as an entrepreneur, you need to have some sense of reality. Like, when should we cut this off? When should we stop? So, reflecting on those two experiences, what kept you going? More particularly, probably in the AstroLabs example, because 3 to 4 years of struggle to hit that point is a significant amount of time. So, what kept you guys going? Because I think a lot of entrepreneurs need to hear these kind of things.
Well, my two experiences are on polar opposite extremes. One is a tech company which is venture backed from the early days, so there's a lot of money, a big focus on speed, almost at any cost, and obviously setting a huge goal which seemed unattainable in the beginning. Launching the website with inventory, getting online, all within basically months. In an environment that was still very nascent, even in terms of being able to get the licenses we needed. So it was a breakneck pace and a great learning experience. But in terms of building a sustainable company, I fall on the side of kind of the bootstrapped company. The bootstrapped company is one that is, they call them, in entrepreneurship, bootstrapping, because it's like you're lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? So it's you're fueling the company with its own revenues. It keeps you quite honest from a very early day on where are you driving real value, and you make sure that you are focused on those things which are actually generating revenue as you build incrementally in a more solid foundation. Obviously, it's like one approach. If you take a lot of money, it's like jet fuel that you pour into a project. It could be fantastic and grow you much, much faster. But if you haven't fully figured out exactly who your customer is and what your niche is, it can also be dangerous. And there's lots of stories of startups that raise a bunch of money and then go crashing and burning, right? Because they spend it in the wrong way. So I think that there's a lot of benefit to actually building a company on its own revenues. And my experience in AstroLabs was one where Louis and I started it with nothing. I mean, we literally started doing training programs that help other founders through the journey that we had been through, and charging them for that, as well as you mentioned a couple of the brands that we were able to luckily get associated with us and get funding from the likes of Google and PayPal and other international companies to support this in the early days. Now, I must say that the journey of a bootstrap startup is a difficult one. It's all difficult, no matter how you do it. But one of the things to watch out for if you're doing it this way is that you're always just chasing after wherever you can find revenue, right?
True, very true.
And where we ended up having almost so many limbs, so many different pieces of revenue, right? A little bit here, we were running some classes and making some money there. We were running, at one point, when it was at its worst in terms of how many diverse things we were doing, we were selling everything from, let's say, a $500 seat to attend a course, to pitching ourselves to government tenders that are in the $1 million range. So you imagine that kind of scale. And at a small company level, it's very difficult to do both of those things well, right?
Yeah.
But it's also difficult to cut off a limb because the classes bring in money and it's consistent and the big tenders are unpredictable. So it's very hard to make that strategic decision to say, no, I got to stop all this stuff and I really need to focus here.
Yeah.
I think that was a big turning point for us.
And you, so in the bootstrapped example with AstroLabs, you said on the podcast that people can get sloppy when they have a lot of money. And listening to your story on how, you need to, it's hard to cut off that limb that's generating revenue, although you might be starting to shift the business to a different direction. I also know at one point you and Louis you were about to take investment for AstroLabs. So what, I guess, stopped you guys? And as you reflect now, all the years down the line, do you think it would have accelerated, or I know you're happy with how it went, but how would it have changed things?
Yeah, it's obviously quite risky to try to just do it without any funding.
Sure.
I don't have a cushion. The story was that early in the days when we had a co-working space in Dubai, some ideas about what we could do. The model we were thinking was a bit more around co-working. there were investors who were interested, angel investors, in putting a check in. And we had taken the process all the way through to due diligence. They were ready to actually put the money in. And it was in their hands to actually go and just finish signing the docs and just to be able to, let's just make it happen. And they just kept dragging their feet. And this guy's traveling and whatever and da-da-da-da. And in this period, Lewis and I are kind of trying to figure things out. We're a little bit, and we wake up one day after being frustrated, not moving this process forward, and also thinking about what kind of indicator that is on like what the relationship might look like in the future. Like, I think we could do this like on our own. He's like, are you sure? This is kind of like back and forth. And then we're just like, you know what, let's just go for it. And I think that's part of entrepreneurship as well. I mean, in the end, you're taking a risk. You're putting yourself out there, and it's an appetite for risk. And we decided, let's just go all in. We sent an email that was like very exciting at the time, which was basically like, very nicely worded. Thank you so much. But we've decided that because this has taken too long, we're gonna just go. We're gonna go without funding for now. Yeah. And we're open to reopening the discussions in the future. And then immediately we go, so wait, hold on a second. It's like, no, the decision for now is final. This is what we're gonna do. And in retrospect, obviously, now that it worked, that it was the best decision because we have full flexibility over the direction of the company. There's no too many cooks in the kitchen. Obviously, it could have turned the other way.
True.
And not having that cushion is challenging. So I don't think there's a single right answer besides saying that you should have very good alignment with whoever you're bringing on as an investor.
I think that's such a great point because I wanted to come back to the Namshi experience, for example, because you guys got a significant amount of investment, and interesting that a lot of it was from Europe and the US, not local as well. So the bootstrap version is hard in one way, but now I feel, because I agree with you, I prefer the way you did it, just personality-wise. I think slow and just reflecting on my journey so far, that's what it's been.
Yeah. One-man show.
Yeah, it's just me, Yeah. But this year, honestly, Muhammad, is like this January, I was like, okay, I feel like I've not maxed out, but like I've reached a plateau of what Khalid can produce by himself. Now it's time to bring in, graphic designers, website people. It's time to invest, and it can hurt, but it's time to invest. But this is what you need to do. I feel comfortable now to take it to that next level. Yeah. Looking at when you're at Namshi, I would assume, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a lot harder when you have someone else to answer to and investors because it was just you and Lewis and AstroLabs, so you could move the way you guys felt was right and direct it. But when you have stakeholders who have made significant investments and want a return like tomorrow, I'm sure that brings a whole different set of challenges.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the business model that you choose to pursue.
The business model.
So if you pick a business model that requires a lot of funding, you've made that decision up front because you cannot run, for instance, a fashion e-commerce company without funding. The way that model works is that although you could do some e-commerce without funding because you can do a marketplace model or you can just-in-time source things with fashion, you can't because you actually have to source the product, buy it, put it in a warehouse. It's very difficult to do without getting funding. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why we picked that model is because we had the competitive advantage of access to capital, which was not available in the region at the time, right? So one piece of advice is to think about, making sure that the model that you're picking for whatever business you want to pursue aligns with your interest in working with investors, et cetera. And the other thing to think about is timing, right? So, you can always start a company, bootstrapped, even if it is the most capital-intensive company. You can always get started. And it's a matter of proving out, your thesis, proving out who your customers are, that it has potential for, real revenues, profitability. The more you de-risk and the more you figure out along the way, the higher the valuation is, the more investors will be interested, the more power you have actually in that relationship.
One thing I've never understood, Muhammad, when it comes to like investing in companies is it seems that, let's say our Series A, we raised 50 million, and then there's this dreaded thing called the down round. I've never personally, I'd love to hear from you, understood why is a down round so negatively perceived? Because what if we just needed this extra thing? Okay, we didn't hit what we wanted, but maybe this extra round, although it's at a lower valuation, will help us, kind of go down and then hockey puck back up.
I guess it's because the hockey puck back up doesn't usually happen. So that
fair enough.
Pattern recognition, when you see a company that's been, again, these are high risk startups, and their entire thesis is that you're investing in something that's going like this. And so you get excited people and then institutional money, so venture capitalists that will put money at a certain valuation. So they'll say, okay, the company at this stage is worth like $10 million. And so on that basis, I'm willing to put in $1 million or $2 million or whatever the case may be. If after a period, the consensus of the investing community is that actually is not worth that money, it becomes very difficult to raise other capital. You might have the investors who are already invested wanting to protect their investment to say, okay, even though it's not going well, I still believe in this founder, I still believe in the idea, and they're just going through a rough patch. I'm going to re-up on it. But convincing others to join that ship is extremely difficult,
sure,
especially relative to their portfolio of options, because then they can just put it into something else, right? So that's why a down round, you have to be very careful, not to be too excited about getting an amazing valuation in a great market and take a very high valuation that sets yourself up for, well, you better be able to really
deliver on that,
increase
right?
it. Yeah, deliver on that. Otherwise, you're in a very awkward position.
So when it comes to, because I think this is an area that people don't really pay attention to, like obviously when you see like on LinkedIn and in the newspaper, X company raised, it sounds great, woohoo! But no one talks about the responsibility, the risk, and all those other things that come with it. So let's say I came to you like, Muhammad, you know what? I have my business. I want to start bringing in investment. How do I, as the entrepreneur, value in a way that, okay, there is, that factors in the potential, but also doesn't shoot myself in the foot?
Yeah, I think, fueling a company for growth it's quite important, as we said, especially based on certain business models that require extra capital, whether that is you're early and you want to go really fast and capture the market, right? Because you've figured something out and you don't want to meander around while 10 other people eat your lunch. So the speed might be of the essence. You might also have found something where actually, the unit economics don't look so good when you're very small. But if you're able to increase the size of this thing, you can get to a much better cost base and understand. You might have just figured out like a machine. This is the best case scenario where what are VCs looking for? A machine where you put money in and more money comes out.
Yeah.
Right? So I was interviewing... there's the founders of Karzati, actually in one of my courses at London Business School. I wrote a case on the Karzati journey, which is a startup started in Oman.
Okay.
And they expanded into Dubai and the Gulf, etc. The whole premise was, selling used cars, right? And it took different forms. They tried multiple business models. They imported cars from Oman into Dubai and Dubai into Oman, and they did all different types of things. In the end, what they figured out was there's this thing in the US called the Kelley Blue Book, which gives you the price, the market price for any year, make, model, etc. of a car, right? And depending on its condition. There wasn't an equivalent here, right? So really, a lot of people were flying blind in terms of valuation of the cars. They used their market presence and knowledge and data in order to build up the most comprehensive data set that you can say, I have a 2014 Honda Civic with these features and this trim, etc. It'll tell you it's worth this number of dirhams. Now that's powerful because that enables them to buy at the right price and sell, and they know exactly how long it'll take them to sell it. So once they crack that, then it's like, okay, well, I just need to fuel this machine. I want to just go be able to buy up all this inventory and make the margin on all the cars. So that's just one example of when it makes a ton of sense to say, oh, shoot, I need to go and raise money. And for them, they ended up with great offers on the capital raising side, but they also were so exciting that they got a great offer to be acquired, and they actually sold the company.
Yeah.
And exited it.
So it's see, these are the kind of stories, and I think in every entrepreneurship journey is you might start with one thing, with one business model or one idea, and down the line through experience, through gathering, finding that sweet spot, you're like, oh, this actually could be even bigger and more powerful and less risky for us. I think a very important point you mentioned, Muhammad, was as an entrepreneur to think about those two very key things. Number one, the business model and what that will require and what are the risks that come with that. But number two, and which I learned from your story, is self-awareness. Because although, yeah, that might be a business I want to do, but do I have the self-awareness, the humility, the personality to fit into that model? So I wanted to ask you, because I think your self-awareness has guided you quite well through your career. How, as an entrepreneur, do I start building that muscle?
Yeah. Well, it's a good point. There is something called product market fit,
yes,
right? Which we teach in entrepreneurship. You need to make sure that product actually meets a real need in the market. And when you get the product market fit and it works right, lots of good things start to happen. What's not talked about as often is actually the founder product fit, right? So
yeah.
What you yourself as a founder are best suited for, and sometimes through the journey, as we've seen in many cases, very rarely does the idea that you first started with end up being the thing.
Yeah, true.
And that's why a lot of smart early stage investors, they will weigh much more heavily the founder as a person and their experience. Also, if they've done something and failed, that's amazing. How they persevere through the difficult times, right? So examples of really fighting and keeping at it, because that's so. These things are even more important than the idea, because the idea, as we know, there's lots of ideas out there, and usually it's not really a something so unique and patentable, etc. It's just, does this founder have what it takes? And then the realities of the market will strike, and suddenly it's like you're in a situation. It's like, okay, this is what I thought I was going to do, but I need to really adjust and change course. And that's part of the journey as well. That's part of the fun of the journey. And I think for me, I've taken that's definitely been true. Reflecting on the AstroLabs journey, we started with the idea that we wanted to bottle up some of the things that we had learned as founders and share that with other founders, which was amazing. It was a lot of fun. We traveled from Beirut to Amman to Riyadh back in 2013-14 when the Saudi scene was almost non-existent. We went a couple times to Riyadh and Jeddah and Khobar and all these places in order to directly connect with the founders and try to support them and be there. It was exciting. It was fun. We felt the impact. But in the end, the business model was very difficult because we relied so heavily on the support of large brands. And in the end, if you have a room full of founders, how much are they going to pay you? Actually, it's like a service towards the people who can pay the least, right?
Yeah, very true.
So I think that's one of the challenges in servicing the entrepreneurship ecosystem. And so then we had to figure out a new way, but it was not. Also, in retrospect, I can tell you a story about how it all lines up perfectly. But the reality was, we were in that mode, keenly aware we needed to add something else. And then one day, we were having a discussion with our counterpart at, you had mentioned the DMCC, which is the largest free zone here in Dubai, and a partner of ours from the beginning. And James, who was our counterpart at the DMCC, was just kind of lamenting that there's this deal that we had worked so hard to get to the finish line. It was at the desk of the chairman and to finally sign. Everything was lined up. And then this co-working company in Europe pulled out at the last minute. And so he was mostly he was kind of just sharing this complaint. And he was trying to figure out what am I going to do? Like Louis and I kind of look at each other and we're like, we do that.
Yeah.
he's like, really? It's like, yeah, we do co-working. We're like, yeah, sure, we can do that. And James was like, can you get a proposal in front of me? Because like, and this is when, you have this, the universe will turn and suddenly an opportunity will be presented to you, right? And it's like in those moments when you're like, okay, let's just go and make it happen. And we told him, in fact, we think we can bring Google on board, right? Because we had already a relationship with Google. And then we went to Google and we're like, we can bring the Dubai government on board. And they're like, oh. And suddenly we ended up concocting and cooking up a deal which was, the first Google partnered tech hub in the region. And we brought in both the government of Dubai as well as, Google. And it was a huge win for us from a brand perspective and also from a business model perspective that kind of set us up for the next phase. Right?
Yeah.
And now when you think about it, actually that part of the business is a slice of what AstroLabs is, right? So we've changed, we've iterated a few times since then, but I'm just giving you that early iteration, right? And nowadays the company is mostly helping large global kind of companies that are thinking about expanding into the market with their company formation, hiring, a lot of the compliance, payroll, all these things that we didn't even do back then, right? So this is kind of one example, but you can always reflect on the passion and the interest and the underlying concept behind AstroLabs is still there. Where did the name come from? The AstroLabe is a navigational device, right? That's perfected by the Arabs, and it was used to navigate by the stars. So we always thought of ourselves as a tool, as somehow to help, guide, and support, right? And to this day, I think that ethos still shines through.
I love that story because you also had to stay in the game long enough for that opportunity to present itself. And not only that, you realized I think this is where the beauty and creativity of entrepreneurship come in, because it wasn't just, you guys have a co-working space, let's try to work something out. We're like, how can we bring more players into the game to bring more value to this that everyone can win from? That's the secret sauce, and I think recognizing those opportunities is what is probably, as an entrepreneur, one of the hardest, I think, things to do, because you could have easily been like, we can, but I don't know, do we have the capability for that? And you have to be like, all right, we're just gonna try to make it happen. Yeah.
You can't be timid, right?
Yeah.
You have to go for it. The other element that's really important is persistence.
Yeah.
The entrepreneur needs to combine two seemingly polar opposite traits, right? So crazy persistence and focus on achieving a goal, that North Star, no matter what anybody says, while at the same time be willing to take feedback and adjust course.
Yeah.
And it's that balance, which is, if you find that in a founder, that's a founder to back. That kind of a founder going after a large, juicy market opportunity is like a recipe for a great investment. And it's a good thing to reflect on yourself. I mean, what examples of crazy persistence? Have I built that muscle? Have I really developed that muscle of going after something even when it's hard over and over again? I reflect on our journey entering Saudi. Saudi was a market, as I mentioned, we had a belief in and an early conviction that it was going to be something. Back from 2013, we were running programs for tech founders in Riyadh, right? And it was hard, the logistics of it, the gathering of them, all this type of thing. But what we noticed when we were there was just the sharpness, the hunger, the kind of engagement. We really enjoyed the programs when we were there. And so we always had this thesis that this is going to be something. So we were there kind of at the gates and pushing and partnering with different organizations. People knew us. Who would have guessed that the regulations would change in the way that they did?
Absolutely.
Right? That was something outside of our control. But what was in our control to be there, present, pushing and trying. And then when the gates opened, who was there knocking at the front, at the front of the door, right? So it wasn't by chance that we were the first, international business incubator that was licensed in Saudi. It's because we've been trying, And I think thinking about those convictions and how long of breath do you have to keep knocking at a door until it opens.
Yeah, I relate to that story a lot, especially on the Saudi aspect, because, for example, I've been doing this for 5 years, my podcast. And I started podcasting just for the love of these kind of conversations, to learn, to educate people. Podcast changed my life. So through my show, I'm trying to give someone else that aha moment, that I had a long time ago. Who would have thought, kind of like what you said, so I was going along, just doing it, having fun with it. Who would have thought now, in 2025, everyone wants to do it? And all of a sudden, not many people have been doing it for as long as I have, or you guys have been doing it in Saudi. So that's where my business opportunity has presented itself. So I resonate with that story quite a bit.
And investing in that is, picking something and gaining depth. I guess the other element I usually like to talk about with our teams or even my students is this, the difference between being somebody who focuses on depth versus breadth. And I used to be someone who was a hopper, and it's almost, it's exciting. You get to try different things. And in college, I had like the most number of classes, and I didn't even care if I had the best grades, or then I was a consultant, and I was like 1 week I'm in Saudi doing real estate, and then I'm in Abu Dhabi doing banking, and it's exciting because you're getting exposed to a lot of stuff. But if you really reflect on it, you're skimming the surface. You're not building something where they're like, okay, Khalid, you've been doing, podcasting well across different platforms for X number of years. Come help me with this, right? And so picking something and going deep into it and spending the time, the years, in order to gain an expertise, that's where the real value in the market comes, especially in a world where, we're becoming more and more augmented with different types of technologies, where the surface level stuff becomes incredibly commoditized.
Yeah.
And so it's the deep level expertise that people are going after, which only comes from really the sweat and the difficulty of going through the muck and building it yourself.
Yeah. I'm so happy you brought up the breadth example, because I wanted to touch on this. So I would say I have depth in my field. However, I'm similar to you, I'm very curious. So I read a lot and about lots of different things that I like to learn from lots of different people. Now, I kind of sit on the fence, because I get on the depth, you become an expert in the field, and you might see opportunities in that field that others won't see because you really understand it. On the flip side, the other half of my brain is like, but if I'm learning so many different things, I might be able to combine two things that no one else has thought to combine. So it's kind of that like toss-up on, obviously I think a balance is probably the best solution, but would love to hear like your thoughts.
I've leaned heavily on the depth side now.
Okay.
And I think of it in this way, because I hear what you're saying. The way I think about it is more like seasons, right? So this is not to say that you need to pick one thing for your life and just go all in on it.
Sure.
But to be thoughtful about, pursuing different things in different parts of your life. A career can span, as one thing, slows down a bit, you want to fill that gap. You want to always be learning and itching to kind of grow yourself. And I think that's one of the, the learning mindset is the most important thing. And that itch that you have, it's just figuring out what the most effective way to channel that itch. That's the thing, in order for it to deliver returns for you. Because a lot of us have that itch of like, I want to learn stuff, and I'm excited about this, and I'm excited about that, But if you pour all of that into at least a similar kind of space, all that extra time and energy and effort ends up netting you something in the end, right? That you can bank. And I think for me, for instance, as the AstroLabs commitment started to decrease, and there was a very competent and effective CEO and management team running the day-to-day operations, I went back to school, right? So I decided, I've just, I'm a big nerd, and I'd love to go very deep in a topic, and I ended up doing research on, Dubai's journey of becoming an innovation ecosystem here, and I did that with the long-term perspective of maybe I could then teach, because I do love, I love that. Partially was a personal challenge. it's good to have some big hairy goal and just go after it with a very definable end point, right? And part of it was like, maybe I can take what I've done in the business world and combine it with an academic lens in order to make a broader impact somehow on the way that, these types of innovation ecosystems are developed and across the region. So my point is that not everybody needs to then go and become a professor or go into the academic world, but to think about what are areas of passion, and then to have the patience to say, what, maybe right now that's not the season for it, but it's definitely open that you're going to have a certain point where maybe there will be an opening, and it's worth just diving straight into it, and then you can add another hat and broaden your experience.
Absolutely. So I had someone on the podcast. We had someone on the podcast a while back, and after she did her master's after working for like 20 years. And I was asking her, I'm like, okay, because this is my, the reason it like messes with my brain a little bit, because this is my mindset. So after I graduated university, I had no inner passion to go like get a master's or get a PhD like you did. I love learning the way I like to learn. So I'm very curious. Every day I'm reading, every day I'm learning about business and this and personal development and mental health, But I don't have that itch to go and down the academic route. Now, what interests me is, because I believe that doing more work, getting more experience will outweigh that. But listening to you and listening to her, I question, I'm like, okay, what did you learn getting your PhD in innovation entrepreneurship that you could not have learned during like your time at AstroLabs? Because I think that is where the interesting thing becomes.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about the process.
The process.
So you going through something very hard that you're not going to love every day. It's not like, oh, I'm interested in this article about this, and so I'll read it, and then the next day I'm interested in something else, so I'll read that. That's fun. There's some benefit in it. You can definitely increase your knowledge base. But I think there's a different complementary skill that going through it now doesn't need to be a PhD, right? This could be anything that you pick, which is like a hard goal with an endpoint. Going through that develops a whole other set of skills, right? So I'll reflect on my PhD journey. There's something in the UK process where you need to do an upgrade, right? So you're kind of first you start as an MPhil, and then you need to upgrade into the PhD. So that requires about an 80-page document that you will have done with the whole literature review, your conceptual framework, exactly where you're planning on going, all that kind of stuff. So I had to develop and write all that stuff, and then you have to defend it, right? So you actually have to take it to in front of a committee.
Exactly.
And defend it.
Yeah.
And so, I'm back, I run my own company, whatever, and this is about innovation. No big deal, right?
Sure.
So I write up the thing. I obviously like crammed it because like I was so busy with work and whatever, but whatever. I got it done.
Yeah.
Submitted it. And then I go to the defense. And it starts, and I'm like confident, doing my thing. And then one point after the other, I'm getting like hammered here, right? I'm like sweating bullets.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'm like, wow, this is uncomfortable. Like I'm getting really like, this is not right. It's not like what I've done is not very good. A lot of that had to do with me just applying my methodology and way of doing things to academia, which is not the way it's done. You need to actually be from within and understand how to position your argument within the academic language and understand that, and that's a skill. And I was kind of very arrogant to think that I could just like walk in there and be like, this is the way it is. And so, I will never forget, there was a point at which I had this almost like an out-of-body experience where you kind of like just go above the whole thing and you see the committee and you see yourself and you're like, actually, you're learning right now. This is great. Just like
Absolutely.
Embrace it, right? And I took the feedback and it was uncomfortable, and they failed me, and they said you got to go back and try. You got to do it again. And so I went back and I tried again, right? And I tried much harder. So it's this, and then, alhamdulillah, I passed, thank God I was able to pass that.
Yeah.
But it's these types of things. Those moments actually it's almost like it's going to the gym. I mean, you're training a certain muscle.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say that it's not just about the academia of it. That's what I mean about the process.
I think the process is the area that I haven't considered when asking myself this kind of question, because I always looked at it as the theory, the literature, what am I actually learning, from this text. Listening to that story and the process of that you have to now shift your focus to deliver this now a brand new framework and an academic framework. That must have been a very humbling experience, which is always good. I think being humble is a very good thing. But listening to your story, what I was taking from it, I'm like, because when you built your 80-page thing, you must have thought quite deeply about this presentation. But then that experience shows you like, there's a deeper level of thinking you need to go to. And I'm Muhammad right now, I'm on a journey. That's why I'm speaking to experts like you on this show or on my podcast. I'm trying to train myself to ask question number 2.
Yeah.
Because question number 2 is where all the value is, at least in my perspective.
The more we learn, the more we realize how little we know.
Facts.
I think
Yeah.
that's for sure. And I think it's learning more is the most humbling thing.
For sure.
And I think also, for me at least, it's appreciating true mastery in something. Like when somebody really knows what they're doing, it's like that's not something you just pick up. That's something that you go through. Again, I mean, you liken it to almost like you can see it in the physical world. Like if somebody who's like, this massive muscle building, champion of the world, you're like, wow, this person put in the time. This is an Olympic grade weightlifter. And there's a corollary to that, which is, your own training of yourself to be persistent, to gain those skills, wrapping it back up to entrepreneurship. There's an underlying skill set, which, although I'm a firm believer that entrepreneurship can be taught as a discipline, I mean, I teach it, right? So I do believe that you can learn the toolkit because there is a method to the madness. But at the same time, there are traits and underlying, approaches which will make you more successful.
Sure.
And things that also, these things are not necessarily you're born with them. You can actually train up on them and become stronger at them. And I had mentioned some of them, but it's like, the degree to which you are persistent, the degree to which you're willing to take feedback and be humble and learn from others, your willingness to actually, take transmitted knowledge from a master and actually learn from others is like a really important factor that will help you be more successful as an entrepreneur. So there's all these factors that I think are important to build up in order to then, no matter what the idea is, how big it's going to be, $1 billion company, whatever, if you at your core don't have some of these like traits, you can't avail yourself of that opportunity.
I'm so happy you touched on the traits aspect because, like you said, there is a method to the madness. There are certain steps and processes and things you need to that will give you the highest chance of being successful. Yeah. My perspective on entrepreneurship and just reflecting on my journey so far is it's the ultimate personal development playground because you will be tested in a job. Not that you won't, but as an entrepreneur and you're trying to build something, like you said, I can learn all the skills, but it's this work I've had to do on myself as Khalid that has been probably the hardest thing to do because you start to realize your limitations, your fears, what am I good at, what am I bad at, and I think people neglect the self-improvement area that is required to lay the foundation that you're talking about for entrepreneurship.
Yeah, it's a journey. I mean, and it's I would say there's benefit to developing yourself on some of these fronts before engaging in an entrepreneurial journey, right? So because there's this kind of typical perception of the college dropout that goes and starts a company or somebody, but really most wildly successful entrepreneurs do that a bit later. Again, back to the phases or seasons in life. just because you've started down your career as an employee in a larger company does not mean that you cannot be an entrepreneur. In fact, actually, most solid entrepreneurs start that way.
Exactly.
Right. So that's an important factor. And then if you know that you're planning on heading in that direction, there are certain ways to start your journey to set yourself up to gain the skills and gain the expertise that you need to be successful afterwards.
Yeah.
So joining on a team that has raised some capital and is kind of in scaling mode, but not too big, so that there's like this hunger and a lot of opportunity, and the sharp people will just get more and more responsibility. Being in that kind of environment where you have a solid manager and there's a big goal that you're going after can a lot of times be a lot better training ground than going off and trying to start your own one-person thing.
Absolutely.
Right? Because
yeah.
you will just gain this incredible skill set, and then you can go and apply that to do whatever you want.
Absolutely. And you're learning on someone else's dollar.
Exactly. So you're getting paid a salary. You may even have some upside in the company, but at the same time, you're soaking it all in.
Yeah.
It's this lesson that you're learning every day through firsthand experience.
Absolutely. Coming back to just the ideas, we touched on it earlier, that nowadays I feel like it's hard to have a unique, brand new, no one's thought of this idea. So I had someone on my podcast who was talking about what his definition of a true entrepreneur and a good businessman. So from his perspective, he's saying a true entrepreneur has novelty. They're doing something in a different way. And you and Noor in your episode touched on copycats, because copycats are, I've seen the business model, I'm just going to bring it here, but I can do better, faster, more efficient, and so on. So I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? What do you think of that? What would you define as in quotations, a true entrepreneur?
So, I reflect a lot on the actually, as part of my research, I looked at innovation and what is innovation.
Yeah.
And to get very academic, the academic Schumpeter defined it as new combinations, which I love. Right. In the end, there's very little which is absolutely new.
Absolutely.
Somehow
yeah.
you are combining things in different ways. So even the examples that Noor Swade, the venture capitalist who I interviewed, gave about absolutely new things, when you look at it, it's actually some combination of this business model applied to this domain. Right?
You're almost like an aggregator, right?
So there's some element that you're taking from here, you're noticing maybe a gap, and you're applying it elsewhere. And some entrepreneurs will wholesale just take a model that works in one market and apply it to another. So in our case, when we were starting Namshi, we were never claiming that this is an absolutely new thing, right? Which is that people had bought shoes and clothes and all this stuff online for since the 90s actually, when Zappos in the late 90s started it. So the model itself had been tested. The challenge was actually applying it to the market.
There you go.
And you can't underestimate that challenge, because a lot of the conditions within the market will necessitate changes to the business model. So the example from Namshi days was the shipping and delivery logistics that were available at the time, especially internationally. So when you're shipping things out to Saudi or other markets, were nowhere near as sophisticated and robust as the U.S.
Sure.
Where one of these companies like an Amazon or a Zappos, they just package up an order, hand it off to FedEx, UPS, and it's done. Game over, unless there's a return, but also they'll handle the reverse logistics. Here, it was the challenge of the reliability of the shippers, but even more dangerously was the combination of that with payments, because credit card payments were still not in vogue. So a lot of it was cash on delivery. So suddenly you've wrapped up a less developed, shipping infrastructure with relying on that actually to get your revenue, because the shipment needs to get delivered and cash needs to be exchanged. So you have to build a lot of systems and processes and a lot of things that you would not need in another market, you actually have to build from scratch.
Yeah.
And I think that although some of the business models at a surface level look the same, when you apply it into a new market, you need to think differently and approach it differently. So for me, that's at the core of entrepreneurship.
Okay.
So I don't look at entrepreneurship as being something like a true entrepreneur needs to bring something that nobody else has done. I think a true entrepreneur is one that's, starting something really from scratch and making it successful, which is hard enough without any other kind of constraints.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah. I love that definition of innovation and, the combining different things together. And that's what creates this brand new thing. Anything we've learned, I think anything we produce, we are standing on the shoulders of giants before us. And it's just, like a really important point you said is, even if I copy paste that model and put it here, the realities of this market and what it demands and the systems that you guys had to build and dealing with shipping and credit cards, for example, is going to be completely different. So in a way, although there's that model, it's still pretty much brand new.
The shipping and the logistics was only one dimension. Actually, when you look at it, everything across the board, when you're looking at product, so which actual styles are going to sell in these markets. And even that was a changing and moving target. We started in the UAE, where there's a lot of expats, and then suddenly the main market became Saudi, and not just Saudi, but more like tertiary cities in Saudi. And so you have a very different taste that you need to counter for. So on the product side, on the on the logistics side, on a lot of the different elements, you need to build something that works within the context of the market, and that's the role of the entrepreneur.
Yeah. And like you said, it's not just that one specific thing that you're going to have a challenge with. There's so many different layers, even within like just the shipping or just the logistics or the product. There's multiple layers in that you're going to have to figure out and like get right. Coming on to the ecosystem. So I know AstroLabs has played a key role in developing the ecosystem here, in not only in the UAE, but across the region. Now, it's interesting that listening to your conversation with Noor, that 7 years ago, there was only $400 million in funding across, and now last year it closed at $2.6 billion, which does show growth, but it's still nothing compared to like other markets. But one of the key things you guys talked about was the mindset. Back then, the mindset was or as Noor was describing it, they do it better there. It's being done better there. But now regional companies from here are starting to go global. So I want to understand from you, since you've been in it for so long and played such a significant role in developing the ecosystem, how has what shifted in the mindset? What is different now that wasn't there before that's, I guess, propelling all this expansion and growth globally from this part of the world?
There are multiple factors. Talent is incredibly important. After we've had a couple of cycles of significant companies come through an exit, such as Kareem and others that have built, teams of really strong, trained up people, as we talked about, gaining that experience within an organization that is a rocket ship growing, equips you with a certain skill set that then you can go off and start another company. And we've seen that even from early folks at Namshi who started their own companies. It's a bit of the early ecosystem needs some of these large successes to fuel the people game.
Sure.
And I think at the core, it's the founders. And then once you have founders who are, going after big, chunky, large opportunities, the capital will follow, right? I think the capital was always here, honestly. The capital was here. Even when we couldn't raise money from the region, it wasn't that there wasn't money. It was just, was that type of risk capital open to it? And I think the more success stories, they breed a wider array of investors who are willing to put that capital at risk and make it a portion of their portfolio. And we're still tracking quite low in terms of venture, as a percentage of overall investment. But the environment has definitely changed. A lot of people, even now, speaking about the UAE, it's become a global hub for people to move from around the world.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing that's contributing to the rise in real estate and prices and a lot of the other factors that we're seeing here. There's an interest in being here, and so I think we're entering into a new phase where we have both, the talent, capital, access to some really interesting markets, such as Saudi Arabia and other proximate markets that are now coming online. You'll see some of these emerging markets also become bigger and bigger targets all of a sudden. Right?
Yeah.
It'll be just like, suddenly the Pakistani market opened up for Careem, and they had, they were employing 100,000 people. These things where, when they entered, there was barely smartphones and 3G.
Sure.
So these things can happen so fast, and I think we're on the precipice of this.
Yeah. We had Faris Saad, who's the regional director for Meta, on the show.
Yes.
Shout out Faris. And he told me, because we were discussing like innovation and adoption. So historically, I'd say this region, we haven't been the best at innovating, but we're very quick to adopt. But now, listening to him when we had our discussion and listening to you, it seems now it's starting to shift. Not only, I think the adoption will always be there, we're just a culture that consumes and adopts quite quickly. But now, innovation from this region and this part of the world, I think, is now starting to really put it on the mark. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it has improved. We still have a long way to go.
Sure.
We have massive opportunities to tackle markets that are overlooked by companies that are out of Silicon Valley or even out of London. So I think instead of just thinking of it as like a head-to-head competition, thinking about what edge do founders here have in order to take whatever they're building and apply it to markets that may have massive populations and potential, but are just not on the radar of some of the other global players.
Yeah, I think, and recognizing that opportunity and where things are going is going to be a very significant factor.
Yeah, the willingness to, again, the long breath, the persistence. These markets are hard. There's nothing. I think in business there's no easy wins.
Absolutely.
Right? It's just like you got to pick your flavor of hard.
Yeah, very true.
And that's a lot of self-awareness. What do I think in reflecting on my own journey, I'm a pretty persistent person. And so places where actually in the beginning I thought, regulatory risk and all this stuff and getting through these hurdles is very challenging. Actually, that's like a sweet spot, like going through and just battering at it and being the one who's willing to go through the hard negotiations and that's a moat.
Of course.
But you need to know yourself you're willing to go put the years in to do that. Otherwise, pick something else.
Yeah.
Right? There's different ways of doing it, but it's just like that's one model, and it is a very viable and could be a successful model, but you also need to reflect on what fits your personality.
Yeah, I love the way you described it, pick your flavor of hard, because it's all hard. There's no easy wins, and there's no shortcuts, and things are going to take time no matter what you're trying to build. I just had a couple more questions, Muhammad, just to round us off.
Sure.
So your experience, not only with the PhD, but with AstroLabs, is ecosystems and innovation ecosystems and building ecosystems. So now if I came to you like, Muhammad, okay, in X part of the world, I want to start building out a startup ecosystem. What have you learned from your experience that are the foundation pillars that need to be there for us to just get started?
So I was reflecting on this as I actually also started teaching in Baghdad. So
okay, no way.
I teach at Baghdad Business School. An entrepreneurship course. This has all happened, actually, my first trip to Iraq since I was much younger. So it was 20 years ago. I went in 2003, and then fast forward 20 years later, it's 2023, kind of end of 2023, I went for the first time. And I met with different organizations and people, and one of them was the business school there. And they asked me, would you teach a course? I was like, oh, sure, I'd love to. And so actually in September, just this last September, I went and I taught a week-long entrepreneurship course to about 60 other students. Reflecting on, a place like Iraq, as we take an example.
Sure.
For the first time in a long time, you have at least some political stability. Some, there's rule of law. There's some semblance of positive kind of vibe and outlook, and so much need, right? Everything. I mean, you can literally build a company to do anything. If you execute it well, it has huge potential. It's just about taking that risk. So what does a place like that
Sure.
Or even now Syria, you imagine, like, hopefully things kind of stabilize, and what they're thinking, how do I build an economy? How do I get things going? And obviously startups and entrepreneurship is a portion of that. I think, besides the obvious fundamental that everybody would talk about in terms of a rule of law and clarity and safety, all these fundamental things, but even before you even have all the regulations figured out, all this stuff, I think you need to engineer, quick wins and publicize them, right? So that might mean, helping a certain company be able to also break through different bureaucracy pieces that you would not be able to fundamentally fix in the beginning. But engineering some wins and making a big deal out of them is a great way to start, because people can get inspired.
Yeah.
And it can show what's possible. And then suddenly, you have to change a whole state apparatus or rules, regulations. These things take time. But you can always, if people see examples that they can really, be proud of, or see people making money, or, being successful, that will encourage others to kind of follow suit. So I think that's one of the most important things when you get started.
Listening to the way you describe it, I was reflecting on Dubai story, like the quick wins and publicizing it. I think Dubai, on using like that terminology, is the best in the world at doing that. Like, I remember growing up here, we moved here in like 95, 96. The first big thing was like Burj Al Arab. Oh my God, first 7-star hotel in the world. That was like, no matter where you travel, like, oh, you live in Dubai, it has that. Emirates Airlines becoming the top airline in the world that flies anywhere and everywhere. Like all these, then Burj Khalifa, like all these things, listening to you describe it like that, it makes me reflect on the Dubai story. I'm like, based on what he's saying, I can see that,
So actually,
I can see that now.
One of the reflections of my research, I had an amazing opportunity to sit with His Excellency Muhammed Mekki, who is one of the, he's a minister of state in the UAE and one of the core engineers, let's say, and engines behind New Dubai, founder of Internet City and many other priorities. So he was telling me the founding story of Internet City, which is actually one of my case studies that I looked at, and how they literally just got on a plane and went to convince, whether it's Bill Gates or the top technology titans of the time, to say you want to make your regional office headquarters in Dubai, and they were able to then get, just even before there was anything called Internet City, just a bunch of ground. There's an iconic picture of His Excellency with the regional head of, I believe this was there was one with like IBM, Microsoft,
yeah.
where they're digging, like they're groundbreaking, and suddenly it's like, if IBM's in and Microsoft's in, and you just sort of get the wheels turning. Right?
Exactly.
But this doesn't come by doing it the old-fashioned way of just, let's wait until, no, you have to engineer the win. So one of the things is like, what do we need to do in order to attract you? And part of it had to do with the telco, connectivity, et cetera, which was not being served yet by Etisalat at the time. This was the reason for the founding of Do. So Do started right here in order to facilitate a lot of these requirements that in a faster way, and just boom, they just made it happen.
Exactly.
So when you can kind of, again, this is about engineering the wins. If you can engineer some wins and then let the momentum take off.
Yeah. I didn't know that story, but listening to it, it makes a lot of sense, because like you said, once you see like, why is this company there? Why is that company there? Maybe we should be there. At least it sparks your curiosity, and then that is step one for you to even come and consider here. Now, reflecting on our conversation today, Muhammad, I know and you touched on it earlier, you look at your life in seasons. So you had the consulting, which was the exploration, then you had AstroLabs, which was a lot more focused, and now then you went into academia with your PhD. So the question I have for you is, what season are you in now, and what's the next season that you plan to go into?
I'm in a deep learning and teaching kind of phase. And I think that the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
And so we kind of are doubling down on that, and then trying to figure out the most effective ways to get some of these messages out and try to be useful to people.
Yeah.
Whether that was, flying into Baghdad in order to make an impact on 60 students who are learning entrepreneurship, to the courses I teach at LBS, to even now hosting my own interview show, bringing in people who have been on amazing journeys in emerging markets and learning through doing and challenges, and trying to extract some of that in a platform that's a bit broader and larger.
Sure.
So I think that for me right now is the flavor or the season.
Yeah. So you want to be the announcer of your knowledge and experience to the rest of us to help us get to that next level.
Even more, exciting for me actually is to facilitate and to bring, the stories of others
Sure.
who are quite inspiring. And that's why I actually love this kind of a format. But usually for me to be on the other side, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think I'm more comfortable on the other side. But thank you. No, thank you so much for.
No, of course, man. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge with us here today. On a personal level, and maybe a bit selfishly, this has been a mind-blowing conversation. You've helped me think about so many different areas and a little bit deeper on reflecting on my journey, and so many people can take so much away from this conversation. We have a final question that we ask all our guests, and you kind of have touched on it in elements throughout our conversation. So the message we're trying to give out with this podcast, Muhammed, is success comes in many forms and learning never stops. That's why we bring on key figures from across the region, like yourself, like many others we've had on the show, and kind of like what you're doing with your podcast. Everyone has a story, and not one story is the same. So, and that is to inspire the next generation of talent and other people who have careers, who want to start a business, to think bigger and learn from all these amazing people who've done amazing things. So I believe in everyone's life, and it's a bit of a hard question, but what I like to call a game changer learning. Something that you learned that was just like broke the ceiling, and you're like, oh my God, I see the world in a completely different way. What was that for you, reflecting, I guess?
I think having the self-awareness of discovering your own weaknesses and areas that you need to improve is so important on the learning journey. And I know for myself, in working with my partner Lewis for so many years, back from even we were colleagues at McKinsey, and then we worked together on Namshi and then AstroLabs since over a decade. One of the things I really admire about him and his approach is his directness and willingness to confront like difficult conversations, and having that confidence where my previous default would be to avoid and just not deal with the difficult stuff and have everybody like me. And I think that I have some of that, but I've definitely become a much more direct person who's willing to have some of the hard conversations. I think a lot of that has come from seeing that modeled and learning from, who was the person right next to me. And I think if we keep ourselves open to thinking about the people who we are closest to, working with, what things in them are inspiring, are effective. You don't need to take the full package. Pick out things that you think are, elements that you're missing, that they've done well, and make a conscious effort to, take on some of that and shift your own way of doing things, and it can be transformational.
I couldn't agree more, Muhammad, and that's such a beautiful way to end, the podcast. Listening to your story and your journey and diving deeper into it with you today has been very eye-opening for me on a personal level, as now, I take my next steps in this journey. And I think anyone who's wanting to be an entrepreneur, is in a job, or is just debating so many of the things we've talked about. Do I raise? Do I bootstrap? Like all these different things. There's so much they can take away from this conversation. So I wanted to say thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Khalid.
Thank you.